Journey of the Magi by T S Eliot. A cold coming we had of it, just the worst time of the year for a journey, and such a long journey. The ways deep and the weather sharp, the very dead of winter, and the camels galled, sore-footed, refractory, lying down in the melting snow. There were times we regretted the summer palaces on slopes, the terraces, and the silken girls bringing sherbet. Then the camel men cursing and grumbling, and running away and wanting their liquor and women, and the night fires going out, and the lack of shelters, and the cities hostile, and the towns unfriendly, and the villages dirty and charging high prices. A hard time we had of it. At the end, we preferred to travel all night, sleeping in snatches, with the voices singing in our ears, saying that this was all folly. Then, at dawn, we came down to a temperate valley, wet below the snow line and smelling of vegetation, with a running stream and a watermill beating the darkness, and 3 trees on the low sky, and an old white horse galloped away in the meadow. Then we came to a tavern with vine leaves over the lintel, 6 hands at an open door dicing for pieces of silver, and feet kicking the empty wineskins. But there was no information, and so we continued and arrived at evening, not a moment too soon, finding the place. It was, you may say, satisfactory. All this was a long time ago. I remember, and I would do it again. But set down this. Were we led all that way for birth or death? There was a birth, certainly. We had evidence and no doubt. I had seen birth and death, but had thought they were different. This birth was hard and bitter agony for us, like death, our death. We returned to our places, these kingdoms, but no longer at ease here in the old dispensation, with an alien people clutching their gods. I should be glad of another death. Welcome. Thomas Stearns Eliot was born in Missouri in 1888 on the 26th of September, and he died in London in 1965 at the age of 76. He left the United States In 1910, in order to pursue his studies at the Sorbonne in Paris, where he earned undergraduate and master's degrees. He was the seventh child in his family and the one with the most promise, and his parents supported his studies both financially and emotionally, having high hopes that he would follow an academic career. He returned to Harvard to pursue a doctorate, but in 1914, with the outbreak of war, he returned to Europe and he settled in England, marrying Vivian Haywood the next year in 1915, after only having known her for 3 months. Their anguished marriage is often regarded as inspiration for the Wasteland, which was a great masterpiece written when he was on the brink of a nervous breakdown. Eliot is a giant of modern poetry, and the Wasteland has been seen as the voice of his age. The poem Journey of the Magi, like his major works, reveals just how intertwined Eliot's life was with his work. He wrote it in 1927, just after his conversion to Anglo-Catholicism. He was 39 years old. It was a time of the end of old things and the beginning of new possibilities in his life. On the surface, the poem seems to be about the physical journey undertaken by the 3 wise men who came from the east to Bethlehem to worship at the birth of Christ. But as the poem continues, it seems more and more to represent the spiritual journey undertaken by Eliot himself in choosing to convert to Anglo-Catholicism. In Matthew 2, verses 1 to 12, the Magi are described as noting the star in the sky that the prophets foretold would lead them to the Christ child. The star is described as stopping over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On arrival, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Stanza 1 of the poem seems to demythologize the biblical story of the Magi, and instead of the joy, it emphasizes the hardship and difficulties of the undertaking of this journey. The poem is a monologue delivered by one of the Magi years after the event. A cold coming we had of it, just the worst time of the year for a journey, and such a long journey, the ways deep and the weather sharp, the very dead of winter. At times they regretted their decision, and they think nostalgically of the life they have left behind. The summer palaces, the terraces, and the silken girls bringing sherbet. Far from being idealized, Eliot conveys the Magi as grumpy and crotchety, enduring hardships, the camel men cursing and grumbling and running away and wanting their liquor and women, and the camels galled, sore-footed, refractory, lying down in the melting snow. The repetition of and the enjambed lines emphasizes the seemingly never-ending difficulties on the road to Christianity, summed up in a hard time we had of it. Far from being secure in their choice, they seem to experience self-doubt and the criticism of others, with the voices singing in our ears, saying that this was all folly. These lines suggest the experience may be closer to Eliot's personal spiritual journey. Not least amongst those who criticized Eliot for his conversion was his mentor Ezra Pound, who had also helped Eliot significantly with the editing of the Wasteland. He said, "Tell Possum," his nickname for Eliot, "that the world ends with a bang, not a whimper," quoting from The Hollow Men, and criticizing his move towards faith away from naturalistic reality. Eliot took all criticism with equanimity. He felt that his conversion had been so complete that he felt as if the person who wrote The Wasteland and The Hollow Men was a different person, and that he had a new identity now. In stanza 2, the longer lines, slower tempo, and lulling rhythm signals the change from winter to spring, from harshness to hope, awakening the senses. Then at dawn we came to a temperate valley, wet below the snow line, smelling of vegetation. The reader then embarks on a journey through biblical and literary allusions and symbols, which take us out of the sequential narrative of the Magi's journey and projects us back and forth from present to future to past, to experience what the Magi's are unaware of on their journey in search of the child. The running stream conjures up the idea of baptism, of John baptizing Christ when he is grown up, and of the poet Eliot's baptism as an Anglo-Catholic shortly before writing this poem, of new beginnings. The 3 trees on the low sky of the Magi's journey also alludes to 3 crosses on the hill and the death of Christ in the future. The old white horse that gallops away in the meadow has been seen by Nancy Hargrove as the fading away of the old religions with the coming of Christ. The 6 hands at an open door dicing for pieces of silver may allude to Judas's betrayal of Christ for 30 pieces of silver in the future, or it may allude to the soldiers dicing for Christ's garments after his death. The reader is jolted back into the present of the story of the Magi as they arrive at the birthplace of Christ, which they find, you may say, satisfactory, perhaps implying that it was not ideal for Christ the King. In embryonic form, the powerful concurrent experience of past, present, and future, although not in linear order, may be a glimpse of Eliot's later epiphany as he continued with his spiritual journey, ultimately composing the 4 quartets from 1936 to 1943, after Ash Wednesday and Song for Simeon. We glimpse in the melding of past, present, and future Eliot's extraordinary realization: time present and time past are both perhaps present in time future, and time future contained in time past. In stanza 3, the Magus is now an old man. All this was a long time ago, and we are projected into the present at a distance from the journey in order to engage in a profound philosophical questioning of its significance. He begins with a confident affirmation: I remember, and I would do it again. Despite the difficulties, he does not hesitate in affirming the value of the personal spiritual journey. At the heart of his epiphany, he emphasizing the probing question that is to be immortalized in his poem. But set down this, set down this. Were we led all that way for birth or death? The capital B for birth signals the birth of Christ. There was a birth, certainly. We had evidence and no doubt. I had seen birth and death, but had thought they were different. Perhaps he had thought birth was associated with life, beginning, joy, and that death was associated with sadness. But now he knows this isn't so. Birth implies death, and death implies birth in an endless and inevitable pattern of things. And this has far greater significance than he thought. This birth was hard and bitter agony for us, like death, our death. The paradox is plain. The birth also signified the death of their old way of life, the texture of their life is no longer valid. We return to our places, these kingdoms, but no longer at ease here in the old dispensation with an alien people clutching their gods. They are no longer at ease. That wonderfully evocative phrase, no longer at ease, no longer comfortable in the old way of life, feeling alienated from this. The poem ends by presenting the magus, who is narrating the story, as an old man recalling the journey he and his friends went on long ago, and anticipating his own death with joy and hope in the knowledge that his death will be a new birth into eternal life with God. Please remember to click subscribe, the bell below, and visit me at my website, formuse.org.